Welcome to a special bonus edition of the State of Recruiting, your weekly Horns 24/7 recruiting podcast. I'm Mike Roach. I'm joined as always by Hudson Standish. And this one we wanted to get you to this week. We were kicking around some ideas, and this comes from the brain of my man to the left over there. He called for the ball. We've cleared out the lane, so I'm going to toss it over to him and let him run point on this entire episode. But before we do that, Hudson, how's it going?
Going good, Mike. And I'm sure a lot of our fans are also, just because partially because I'm new and, partially because you're the main attraction. You're the Luka Doncic of this podcast. They're like, oh, God, Tim Hardaway's calling for the ball. Not so sure about this one. But I think it'll be fun. It's getting to that time. As we record right now, it's 94 days until kickoff. So it's getting to that time. Juices are flowing. We're getting a little closer to football season in the state of Texas.
We're getting football excited. We've got camps starting up. We've got 7-on-7 coming. We've got all sorts of things this summer to keep us occupied. And then before we know it, we'll be coaching school and then right into the season. So, should be a lot of fun. So without further ado, tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, so we're going to go through the summer enrollees, freshmen only, and along with the guys that have already been on campus. You and I kind of behind the scenes put a list together, factored in some other, the 247 composite, some other stuff, and kind of are going to go down a little bit of an order, and we're going to go over their freshman expectations, how they fit on the roster, what's their potential timeline to contribute, and then along with their career expectations, almost setting the rubric for them during their time at Texas and even college. Because another thing too, Mike, before we get started, when we're talking about these players, we're talking more about their college career. Yes, what matters the most is how they succeed at Texas. But say that a player, portals after 18 months at Texas, but it ends up at a Mountain West school and is a second or third round draft pick. Well, what we say is going to, I guess, kind of fit in that as well. Like, we want to make sure that we're projecting not only for Texas success, but success in college football in general. Because as you know, one of the kind of unfortunate realities is that probably a good chunk of these kids are not going to finish their career on the 40 acres. But I'm excited to kind of break them down with you.
All right. Well, let's get it started.
So first off on the list, we've got somebody that you covered, I want to say, from the start of their career to the finish, in Arlington Martin, linebacker Travell Johnson. Obviously didn't get to play much his senior year due to injury, if at all. But Mike, overall, quick thoughts on Travell Johnson, and then let's get into the expectations.
Yeah, Travell. So he did miss most of his senior year. He had I think it was a labrum tear.
Did he get one game in or just scrimmages?
So I remember going out there last summer and being like, okay, so you have a labrum tear, so obviously you're going to be out for the year. And he's like, no, I'm going to try to give it a go and see how it goes. And I think he played like 1 or 2 games before they just said, okay, let's get the surgery on this. And so, a really tough kid. I talk about this a lot coming from that program. Arlington Martin, if you watch them on the field, they're not always the most talented. That's kind of crazy to say, considering like they produced Myles Garrett. They have Javian Taviano. Maurice Blackwell came from there. Like, there's a lot of guys that have come out of Martin, but year over year, not the most talented program on the field, but they're extremely tough, and they will turn any game into a dogfight. And I think that Travell kind of exemplifies that. He's a smaller player, but if you watched him in high school, he was all over the field, big tackler, played bigger than his size. So I guess the question for me is really how he will translate the next level. And if this was a Big 12 team moving forward, I would feel a little better about his projection. I think the move to the SEC, I'm really interested to see kind of how his size holds up at that level. But I think he's a guy, if he plays as a freshman, which I don't expect him to, but I think he could be a guy that contributes a lot on special teams. I think he fits kind of in that weak side linebacker role, but he could also be like his former teammate Maurice Blackwell and be a guy that they say, okay, he hasn't grown the way we want him to, so we're going to play him in that star position or in the nickel a little more in the secondary. I think. Sorry, Hudson. This is our first time doing this. You want me to just knock out all the categories in one deal here?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, too, we can just collab through them. When I think freshman expectations, what I had down was exactly what you said. Travell needs to make it an absolute priority to get as many positively graded special teams plays as possible. That way, heading into the next couple of years, he has a foundation of production to build on, then getting on the actual field when it comes to Pete Kwiatkowski's defense.
Yeah, and so I think, do I think he's smart enough to process it? Yes. Do I think he's a good enough football player to get on the field and see spot duty? Yeah, the size does worry me, especially in a league like the SEC. So I think maybe overall career expectations, it would depend on if he's able to find a fit playing in that league or if he decides to transfer and finds a school that's an ideal fit for him there. I think he can be a guy. Football isn't as rigid as it used to be. You don't, the archetype linebackers you don't have to be 6'2", 220 anymore to play linebacker necessarily. Depending on your skill set, I just think a lot of it's going to depend on his fit wherever he ends up.
Absolutely. Let's move on to somebody that we have really grown to kind of love as a prospect and definitely as a personality as well, and that's Grand Prairie's Savion Red. One of the more fun additions to the class when you think about kind of how it all came together towards the end. Obviously, Mike, I know that we were on different message boards at the time, but there still was this collective panic of who is this guy? Why on earth are we taking him? And then as people started to watch the tape, I think it made a little bit more sense of, okay, maybe the reason why he only had 3 offers or so, the best of which being SMU, wasn't exactly because of his play on the football field.
So I don't know if you know this, Hudson, but I'm from a place called Irving, Texas, specifically South Irving, Texas. And Grand Prairie is the southern border of South Irving. So I'm very familiar with the Gophers, their program history, and have known about Red for a while. He was kind of like a youth league legend. And I love, you start hearing about these kids in like 6th or 7th grade, like you won't believe what this kid's doing in little league football. And look, I'm not ever going to evaluate a 6th grader.
We'll never have not DM us with 6th grade tape, please.
Or 7th grade or 8th grade or non-varsity tape in general. But it is fun to kind of like bookmark the name and look and come back to it and see how they panned out. Like another one of those kind of kids is like Wildman over at SOC, just like a youth league legend who's now turned into like a legitimate recruit. Jaquindon Jackson Hudson, you should have heard the hype around Jaquindon Jackson as a youth player. It was insane around these parts. But Savion Red plays at a program that for most of my life has not been good at all. I mean, outside of their years with Rhett Bomar at quarterback in the early 2000s that overlapped me when I played high school, Grand Prairie has been a kind of a perennial bottom dweller. They went to the playoffs this year, and it's not because they suddenly got way better. It's because Savion Red dragged them to the playoffs by himself. I have a good friend of mine works at South Grand Prairie, which is obviously their rival school. And I asked him about him and said, he goes, if he was on our team, we'd still be playing. And if he wasn't on Grand Prairie, they'd be 0-10. So I think.
Mike, how do you feel about this real quick, by the way, as far as freshman expectations go for Savion Red? Let's just say of the kind of lower ranked group, however you want to make that cutoff, could you hear an argument that he maybe could get the most playing time when it comes to just his positional versatility along with kind of the log jams at other positions for the lower ranked guys?
Absolutely. And I think.
And he could be another special teamer too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like a lot like Travell Johnson, fit is going to be very important because people say, what is he? Well, he's kind of a receiver. He's kind of a running back. He played quarterback a lot in high school. He's an athlete. Fit. they're going to have to figure out how to get him on the field and how to best utilize him. I think he's a guy that can play in the slot. I think he's a guy that you could run some wildcat stuff with him, and it would be interesting. I think that it's up to the coaches to figure out how to best utilize him. When you look at him, he's not big. He's 5'10", 205, kind of built like a running back. Not an insane tester, but just ability overall. When you watch him in the open field in high school, he's so good at, vision, feeling, tacklers on one side and being able to cut back. He's really explosive in short area, and I think that kind of translates over to his basketball film. So freshman expectations, I would say probably I had a little more before Texas loaded up at receiver in the portal. I think he could be a guy you see in some packages, or if there's some injuries, or he could be a guy you see on special teams. I don't expect a huge contribution from him as a freshman, but as you said, kind of out of the lower end of the class, if there's one guy picked to surprise, I think I would say it's Red. When he was recruited by Texas, it was seen as like, well, we lost Evan Stewart and Shaz Preston and all these guys, and now they're just reaching for this guy. And a lot of times when you do that at the end of a cycle, it's tough to find a lot of value in a guy. I think they found some value here. So again, I think it's just going to be more about his overall, like what they can do with him. As far as his fit on the roster, I would say slot, but I mean, like I said, he's I would call him a slot back almost. Like you could put him in the backfield, you could put him at slot, you can run him in wildcat, he can be on return for you, things like that. He can be a guy that maybe you line up on the end of a punt block team and send him after the punter. So I think, for him, like Travell Johnson, the career expectations will matter how he's utilized, how creative the coaches can be. And, if he does end up elsewhere, again, finding the right fit for him. He's certainly an electric football player when you just look at football playing ability.
One last thing on Savion Red before we move on, Mike. We talked about this yesterday. Obviously, I think the fans can probably tell that we're higher on Savion Red, both of us, than kind of the industry average recruiting rankings. I think because he was at Grand Prairie and kind of how his recruiting process was handled almost as well, there's a significant chance that Savion Red is a verified better athlete than what the numbers we have on him are.
Absolutely.
And I think that, along with just kind of his off-the-field demeanor, contributes to this massive boom or bust potential that's pretty hard to factor in. So while we are higher on them, I do think that we should probably mention before going, you have a chance with all these kids that in 12 months they're portaled out of here. But, this is one definitely to watch when it comes to just the wild swings that his career could have. I called him almost like a little bit of a pit bull, littler version of little Jordan Humphrey. And I could really see that for his career at Texas where, maybe he is a better athlete than we were thinking and he does go to the NFL. But if not, I could just see him being a really productive college football player. So let's move on to the next guy on the list, and that is Texarkana's Derrick Brown. Mike, I'll let you lead off and we'll try to kind of power through these next couple.
Yeah, Derrick, I think expectation-wise, I would probably say he's a redshirt candidate for me, just from a physical development side. And now was recruited as an edge. I think Texas sees him as a guy who could possibly play off the ball and kind of be like a version of what DeMarvion Overshone is. But he's going to have to put on some weight. I saw him in the spring and he just wasn't developed yet. And a lot of that's going to come from being able to eat 3 meals a day and, work out constantly. We'll see kind of how that separates this summer. I don't expect a lot from Derrick freshman year. I think that, once he gets physically acclimated to the game, I think that Derrick's got a lot of potential. I think he's a really springy, explosive athlete. He's shown some natural pass rush ability, put up similar numbers to what Clayton Smith put up at Texas High before the Oklahoma edge. So, I mean, obviously he can get to the passer. I think probably, it's going to depend on what they do at edge and what they've got available to them at edge. But I think he is possibly a guy that can float between that edge position and kind of an off-ball linebacker. Probably a 2-year guy you're looking at before he's really, challenging for significant playing time. And again, I think a little bit boomer bust, just depending on, kind of how he develops and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, I think that's really well put, Mike. I hope that Derrick stays patient with the process. I don't see him because I struggle seeing Derrick being able to contribute a ton on kick and punt coverage just because of kind of the way he's built, overall speed. But so I hope that he is a little bit patient because I do think that the program could turn him into an extremely good player, but gonna have to put the work in. Next up on the list, we've got Larry Turner-Gooden. Mike, you had a really good read on LTG since he was a sophomore, put out some pretty spectacular tape. But I think it's also fair to say that in the 2 following years, there was a little bit of a downgrade in, what he put out on film.
Yeah. So Larry went to 4 high schools in 4 years, and that's always, it's tough to
flag. Yeah.
Tough to keep the consistency with that. Also battled a ton of injuries. I recall, I don't get to do it as much anymore, but I watched a lot of tape during COVID. Like when we were all quarantined, every time they offered a kid, I could just be like, well, I got nothing else going on. Why don't I just watch a tape? And I remember them offering Larry Turner-Gooden, watching his sophomore film and just being blown away by the type of athlete he was. And so, I think he's put on some bad weight a little bit with the injury. He had a shoulder injury, I believe, last year. So wasn't really able to lift, wasn't really able to exercise. Showed up early at Texas and, to his credit, went through the spring workouts, played in the spring game. Struggled some, I thought, with taking angles and things like that. I think at his best, if he could kind of recapture what he was as a sophomore, he's a pretty dynamic safety prospect. A really good, reads the ball really well, great ball skills, willing to come up and hit, all those sorts of things. It's just going to depend on if he can kind of find that form again. I could see him being a guy, because he was in early, who gets some special teams reps, and maybe, if they're blowing out Louisiana Monroe, get some reps in there. I don't see him challenging for a starting spot in the secondary this year. And really, I'm really interested to see what his leap from this spring to next spring looks like physically, because I do think that all that stuff that I loved about him is still in there. It's just on Larry to kind of find it again. And so, I think, we keep saying it. It's a little bit boomer bust. That's kind of the nature of any bottom of a class when you're talking about it. And I kind of think that's where we are with Larry.
Absolutely. Also, Mike, something that I think should be noted, and you kind of mentioned it, this is one of the ones where I think just the fact that he was able to get on campus early is massive for his potential chances at Texas. When you come in with the rest of the summer enrollees, it's kind of tough to make a mark, and sometimes you can get lost in the wash. The fact that he was able to get that post-injury, just one-on-one coaching and all that attention, I think is just massive for him. Speaking of massive, Malik Agbo is next up. I think the first of Texas's large group of offensive linemen in this class out of Federal Way, Washington. I believe Todd Beamer High School, which awesome high school name. Mike, is it fair to say that Malik also gets a little bit punished as far as kind of our personal rankings and just overall the class in general, just by the fact that he likely is the last guy when it comes to Texas's, 7-person offensive line class?
Yeah, I mean, he's in a stacked class. So maybe, in a different class, we might view him a little better. But I think it's also important to note with guys like Larry Turner and Malik Agbo, and we'll talk about it with Malik Murphy, we never missed a beat with COVID in Texas. We played a season. True. These guys missed seasons, or they missed portions of seasons, and they lived in states where you couldn't, while we were in Texas, we're practicing and playing, they were still, in their house. So I think that's I think in 10 years, we'll look back on the COVID era of college football and the guys that came out of those classes and really, get a feel for like how much that screwed everything up. With Agbo specifically, first want to say elite human being. I mean, one of the most pleasant humans I've ever encountered. Is a guy that has the size Kyle Flood loves. I
Absolutely.
think he's a little top heavy when you look at him. I'm interested to see kind of how he embraces the weight room and Tory Becton's strength program. Um, I think he's a couple years from, he needs to kind of reshape a lot, and he's a couple years from being able to contribute early. And he's coming in with a stacked class. Now their needs at offensive line may preclude that, and he may have to contribute earlier than he's ready for. I think he's a guy that has a lot of athletic ability. The first time I saw him, he was playing 7-on-7 and playing as a tight end, and was moving pretty well out there. So I think, again, like Larry, the it's in there. It's just kind of, can he unlock it? And I think a lot of that's going to be physical weight room stuff. I think if he can, we've seen a lot that, size on the offensive line could do a lot to carry you a long way. And he's definitely got legitimate size. So I think, all things considered, if he can, in the next 2 years, really reshape his body, refine his technique, he could be, he absolutely could be a draftable prospect because of just, you can't teach size.
Absolutely. I think this might be fair for Agbo. Let me know what you think. Freshman expectations, I just really struggled to see, unless there are massive injuries, how he finds his way on the field. He's a little bit hurt by the fact that he's coming in the summer. Fit on roster, I think 2 years is a good 2 years, then let's compete. And then career expectations, if he can be a 2-year starter, I think that's a massive win.
Yeah, absolutely.
Next up, I think one of the more intriguing prospects in the class next up, Xavier Bryce from Arlington Seguin. We got to watch a lot of him because Seguin plays a lot of good competition in district. They have Texas 2023 commit Travell Johnson. And we've just known about Xavier for a while just because of who he's played 7-on-7 with, kind of the interesting recruitment that he had with Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas being involved. Mike, what are your thoughts on Xavier potentially contributing early, and just overall what his career could look like at Texas?
I think outside of Savion Red, which is funny because they're very close friends and state 7-on-7 or club 7-on-7 teammates. This is the guy that, like, out of this bottom half, I could really see exceeding a lot of expectations. I've loved Xavier Bryce for a while. I wrote a couple years ago, I was sitting in the press box at the small school state during COVID, and I had an idea to just write kind of like, hey, here's a bunch of names of guys who don't have many offers yet, but they're going to be household names by the end of their recruitment. And that article actually came out really well. It was, Jay Fair and Hunter Erb and guys that were all Americans, and it really picked it up. And Xavier Bryce was high on that list. He was a receiver early on. I really liked him at corner, and I think his coming out party was last year at the SMU camp. He showed up and really performed in front of that group. Tested extremely well. Did extremely well in coverage drills. He's long. He's athletic. He's bouncy. He's spring. He's lateral. He's really good. I don't know that he's a guy that you necessarily want on the field playing a lot of minutes at corner this year, but I think he could for sure be a special teams guy. I think he can long term, I could see him playing corner or safety. I think he's got a lot of versatility to both. And I think he is a guy that it would not shock me at all because of frame and athletic ability if he's a early round pick, like a top 3 round pick.
I'm with you all the way. As you can see on our private spreadsheet, both of us are pretty high on him compared to the rest of the industry. So co-sign that all the way. And let's just move on to the next one, Zach Swanson, who I'm sure is going to be one of the more closely monitored and kind of interesting studies in this class because, Mike, to kind of just put it bluntly, I think that a lot of fans have some questions about Zach Swanson's ability. And After going through the tape and watching, I do actually think there's a path for him to where if he stays patient with the program, potentially being a contributor by the time that he's, a junior or a redshirt junior senior.
I think it's important in any class that you kind of establish a baseline for positions. And I think Swanson was their baseline for defensive linemen. Like if we get this guy and he gives us what we think he can, we're happy with that. And everything else we recruit is going to be that and above. And I think for Swanson, you look at him, big body, pretty disruptive. I thought pretty quick first step from the interior. I don't know that he's a guy that you see contributing right off the bat, but like a couple of these other guys, I don't think he has as far to go physically for one. He's already in pretty good shape, pretty big frame. I think in the next year, maybe this time next year, we're looking at, okay, can Zach Swanson give some rotational snaps and then kind of build on it from there? Can he be a part-time starter? Can he be a full-time starter? I think by the end of his career, and I see him probably as, he could play kind of that strong side in, but I kind of see him as like a 3 technique almost.
Yeah, I have him pegged as the 3 tech.
So I think by the end of his career, and look, let's be honest, your job as a coach is to recruit a guy like Zach Swanson, and then Bo Davis's job is to recruit over him, to recruit so much overwhelming talent that even a guy who I think is a pretty good player, and I'm probably a little higher on him than everybody, your job is to kind of out recruit him. And so if he gets out recruited, I guess we'll see kind of where things end up. But if by the end of his career, he's a solid rotational part-time starter, with a chance to go to camp with the team in the NFL, I think that's a win for kind of establishing the baseline of that class. And I think to a larger point, people think, well, if a guy's not a first-round pick, he's not a success. If a guy like Zach Swanson gives you quality snaps and then gets a camp invite or is undrafted or is even a late-round pick, that's a win. In my opinion.
Absolutely. Mike, let's go ahead and move on to one of your favorite kids in the class and somebody that I think is probably one of the sleeper candidates for the 22 class, and that's Austin Westlake's Connor Robertson. Obviously, when you talk about roster fit for him, I think it's pretty clear that everybody sees him as a center.
Center guard, probably center. I know Cole Hudson kind of wants to play center too. Like that's something he's interested in. So, we'll talk about Cole in a minute. But like, Cole's a really smart kid. He told me like, hey, centers make a little more money if they're good. So, I think he's kind of been focused on that. But for Connor, again, and it's I guess maybe unfair to say baseline since we've already talked about Malik Agbo as another offensive lineman, but Connor is kind of the baseline physically, whereas Agbo's more of a like high ceiling project.
And they put Connor first, correct?
I'm sorry.
Connor was the first take of the class. So when you talk about baseline, like that was the true baseline for the class. Agbo was one of the later guys taken. So that was just a pure,
Yeah. Connor and Cole committed on the same day, around 2 hours in between each other. Those were the first 2 guys in the class. But yeah, I think Connor was kind of the physical baseline. And I always kind of put it as like, if you're going to, Connor's probably a little physically limited, not as athletic as some of the other guys on the list, but tough, hard-nosed, experienced, probably played more games than any offensive lineman on this list by virtue of the deep runs that Westlake made in the playoffs, 16 games each season. And man, if you're going to take guys like to establish a baseline, taking them from a program like Westlake that's had such excellence on the offensive line, I think is absolutely the way to go. I think he's a guy that you can pencil in if, he gets to kind of where they think he can be. You could pencil him in every week. It's like, okay, we're going to get a solid contribution from Connor here. I think he's a guy that could be a, late round pick. I see him probably, I think Texas would love for his timeline to be like 2 or 3 years. You don't necessarily want to rush offensive linemen. They may not have the option. It may be a Zach Shackelford type of thing where it's like, we've just got to play him now. And I think Shackelford's not kind of that far off from what you could envision Robertson as at the college level. And Zach had a cup of coffee in the NFL, but played a long career, a productive career at Texas. So I think for me, that's kind of the way I see Connor filling out guard, center, and a guy that you hope by like sophomore, junior year, he's starting to round into an all-conference player.
Mike, one last thing on Connor that I think we should say too, just for a kind of peek behind the curtain for fans. We were kind of talking about potential freshmen or even some older players that, hey, once fall camp goes around, like, shit gets real. Like, you're out there for days in the heat, tensions flare. Like, sometimes guys get punked. We both immediately were like, yeah, Connor Robertson's not going to get punked out there. Even though some perception might be, oh, he's from Westlake, blah, blah, blah. That's one tough interior offensive lineman. And I think that his baseline toughness, technique, I really think that he's going to have some success at Texas. Because another thing that I think we should mention too, when we're just talking about evaluations, I don't think that Connor Robertson's going to go anywhere. I don't think that this could be clipped later if he ends up in the portal, but he definitely strikes me as somebody who's going to be patient, that's going to trust Flood and their developmental timeline. And I don't know. I just see him as somebody that's going to stick it out at Texas and I think turn into a really nice prospect.
Yeah, and I think if you question the toughness of anybody in that Westlake program, you're probably insane.
Yeah.
Just go watch them practice, watch them play. That's, it may be a upper income suburb school, but it's I wouldn't call Westlake a suburb school, but an upper income group. But man, that's a tough group of kids and coaches there. So yeah, I don't think he's going to blink really. He's been through kind of the version of being at Texas at the high school levels, being at a school like Westlake with the big expectations and going up against some of the best. And so, yeah, I think he's going to definitely benefit from that.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, it is just a perception thing that I see sometimes of, oh, these Westlake boys, they get to Texas. And the Tony Salazar, Todd Dodge Westlake is not maybe what you were thinking from early 2000s, 2010s. So let's move on to our next one. And that is one of the more polarizing takes of the class. Somebody that a lot of fans have rallied behind, some have been a little skeptical of. It's Malik Murphy.
Yeah, a kid that I love, one of my favorites I've covered. And when you talk about the physical tools, if you're just talking physical tools, as good as any I've seen, I mean, can literally throw a football through a brick wall if he wanted to. If you're talking about any quarterback, the odds are they're probably going to not live out their career at the school they signed with. It's just kind of the nature of the position these days. You either win the job or you don't. And if you don't, you transfer on. I think Malik, especially coming in early and dealing with the injury and not getting a ton of reps in the spring, I would love to see him be patient and really embrace developing the finer parts of his game under Steve Sarkisian and AJ Milwee. I think if he can, he's a guy that maybe, a lot's going to depend. How does Quinn Ewers play? Does Texas get Arch Manning? How would Arch Manning do if he gets there? But I think you could see Malik be a guy who, if he really embraces the process and the patience, be a junior or senior starter, like a 2-year guy. And then maybe even be able to grad transfer somewhere else to get a little more NFL stock. That's kind of the goal for me with him. I think I've always said that if you've got the tools, I think the thing that holds kids back is being lazy or uncoachable. Malik Murphy is neither of those. And so I think if he embraces the patience of it, if he really goes to work on, the biggest issue for him, it's not a mechanics issue. It's not as much of his feet. Now, he's got a little work to do with those things, but it's not like most people you think of. It's the reps. He just didn't get a lot of live bullets in his high school career. And if he can really embrace those things, I think he's a guy with absolute NFL arm talent. That there's no doubt about that. And whether it be at Texas as a late starter or somewhere else in the country, I think he is a guy that, depending on the opportunity he gets, and again, finding the right fit for himself, he could be an NFL guy, absolutely.
Mike, I had a couple of things written down for Malik. One, and I think you kind of touched on it, control what you can control. Don't get impatient and immediately look to bounce, because I think that you've seen some Texas quarterbacks and just other quarterbacks throughout the nation. You have a lot more of a chance of success if you take 2 or 3 years, grad transfer somewhere, or even with the one-time waiver, get to show up already having done, spring camp, everything a couple times. Don't immediately rush out if it looks like, they're going to get Arch Manning or whatever. Control what you can control. Put the head down, work. Another thing, too, as a prospect, he improved so much from his junior to his senior year, in my opinion. He bumped him multiple points on my personal grading system. And I think that when you look at what NFL teams are valuing at the quarterback position now, looking into the future as well, with just kind of how guys are getting mocked in the upcoming draft, and also the draft data that we have, guys with tools, guys with big frames are starting to maybe hit a little bit more than the mini renaissance that we had with the shorter quarterbacks that were more ball placement heavy. Like there's something to be said about it being a copycat league, and the guys at the quarterback position that teams want to copy are Justin Herbert and Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes, guys with freakishly tool sets that can put the ball anywhere. And that's what Malik Murphy can do. I think the last thing when you talk about the quarterback dominoes here is just thinking how a potential Arch Manning, if he did end up at Texas, and Malik Murphy battle would go. And I don't know. It's really intriguing, Mike. I think that would be a pretty interesting one, considering that Malik would have a full year. And, even if he did portal out, that would then give him the opportunity to just one and done it and head to the league, which I do think that if he maximizes, that's where he's going to go.
Yeah. And not a better kid to root for. I'll say that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Next up, and I think this is kind of an easy one, and this is somebody that I had a pretty good relationship. One of my first, actually, as a recruiting reporter, is South Haven, Mississippi's Aaron Bryant. I believe I did this research a while back, so somebody could prove me wrong, but I believe he is the first high school signee from the state of Mississippi to ever play at Texas. So pretty neat there. I think a really high floor prospect when you look at a nose tackle. And that's the fit that I think that he's going to play. And I think that he'll eventually be a probably 2 or 3 year contributor. What's up, Winnie?
Yeah, I think somebody's at the door.
I think that he'll be a 2 to 3 year contributor at Texas, and maybe just knock 1 or 2 years as far as a starter. What I pitched you on yesterday, and I think that it's a pretty good comp, I think that he's an upgraded version of Chris Nelson.
Yeah, I think that's a really good comp. And you've got a lot more familiarity with him. I haven't ever met him or seen him live. I kind of asked you a little bit about his body composition, the way he was put together. He's big, really big when you look at him on film, but is it good weight? Is it bad weight? And you had kind of said, he's more chiseled and cut than he is fat. I think if it was a Big 12 Texas going forward, I would worry a little bit about his ability on the field. I think they're going, he will probably be playing in the right league as just a big body that can jam the middle. And I think has some, not just a guy that's going to lean on the center and wait for somebody. He's got some penetrating ability from the middle. And the other thing with guys like Aaron Bryant, like if Aaron Bryant grew up in the state of Texas and had the coaching available to him and the training and all those resources, we might be talking about, a closer to 5-star guy just with his body and everything. He's still got a lot to unlock. I think like offensive linemen, you don't necessarily want to rush defensive linemen unless they are just, freaks that you can't keep off the field. But I think he's a guy that probably maybe, with Keandre Coburn in his final year, you're looking at maybe this time next year is where did Aaron Bryant spring end up? Can we see him being a guy that gives us valuable snaps on defense? Maybe if it's even 10, 15 snaps in a freshman year. And then moving forward, like you said, Chris Nelson, I think, is a great comp if he can be that type of player for Texas. That would be, I think, like Zach Swanson, he's kind of a little more on that baseline, but a little higher ceiling than what Swanson has.
And when we talked to sources in the spring, kind of the keys were what we knew as a high schooler, which is Aaron Bryant is going to give you 100%, if not more, effort on every single play. And he's really coachable and a great kid. So that's about all that you can ask for when you start getting into the middle tier of your prospects in the class. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if Aaron Bryant ended up being like a day 3 pick and had a nice career in the NFL. I wouldn't be surprised at all. Next up, another polarizing prospect, somebody that I think that I'm probably higher than you on, but we all can agree he fits what Kyle Flood wants extremely well, and that is big old Cam Williams from Duncanville. Mike, how do you want to go about this conversation? I mean, it's one of the more interesting ones and one of the ones that I've been looking forward to on this list, just because even from fans, there is a ton of disagreement on, okay, I think that he's the number 2 player in the class, and some people thinking, he's all the way down at the bottom. I mean, the delta is pretty wild with Cam Williams.
Yeah, I think it speaks to kind of what his potential is. I mean, he is boom or bust to the max. When you talk about frame and just height and length and all those sorts of things, Cam Williams is elite in all of those areas. The weight is what bothers me. He played most of his career at 400 pounds or north of it, got down to around 380 in his senior year, which, good for him. I'm glad he was able to get it down, but he's going to have to continue to work on that. I just don't believe you can play at a high level over and over again at that weight. And so, for Cam, I was a little more encouraged by his senior year. I was not a huge fan coming out of his junior year at all. And there's probably not a media member in the market that's seen more Duncanville football than me. So I've seen him throughout his career, and I've seen him come up with all these guys on the offensive line around him, the Savion Birds and, Jalen Early and guys like that. So I think a lot's going to depend on the physical development. He may be called upon this year just because.
Yeah, that's the really intriguing part about this conversation, because Cam Williams, of anybody we've talked about so far, I think by far has the easiest pathway to playing time. And Mike, I mean, just real quick too, as we talk about this, I absolutely agree. His junior tape, I was just I think everybody for the most part kind of wasn't seeing it, and it was him viewed. And then his senior year, he did retool his body, and obviously it's not close to the finish line, but it showed enough, and I think he showed enough just in his own personal play to get really excited about his potential. So, yeah, I mean, Mike, I think this is the next place to go with this conversation. Do you think there's a chance that he could play right tackle this year, or kind of more to what I'm thinking, if he does slot in, he probably just slots in as a jumbo guard?
Yeah, I think if you put the odds on that, I would have to put him as the favorite that he plays this year because they just have the need. And
he's a perfect fit for what Kyle Flood. Like, we can't stress that enough.
Yeah. Fit matters a lot in recruiting. We don't talk about it and we don't rank based off of it, but it should matter. I mean,
But when it comes to expectations, then,
Yeah, it's definitely a conversation to have. I think I would bet a lot of money Cam Williams is called upon, and probably I would say decent odds he starts a game this year at one of those positions. I just think, when they're plugging holes up front and having the issues they're having, they're going to lean on a guy like him who's just big and say, hey, let's put the big guy out there and see what he can do. So, that's going to be on him to really get in there this summer, knowing he's got opportunities ahead of him, and embrace everything and do everything he can in these 3 months and then get to camp and really just turn it on. I think at his best, he's dominant in the run game. He's, his footwork and all those sorts of things need some work in pass blocking. But you're talking about a guy that if he could get to where he needs to be, I mean, I'll give it's not a fair comp, 1-to-1. Evan Neal was that size in high school.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's not out of the question that a guy like him could get in there, do some work on the body, and then be a first round pick. I mean, he's got everything that NFL teams look for in an offensive lineman. It's just, can he get there? I think that's the question. And I'm a little more skeptical, but I think I've got a familiarity bias a little bit, and that goes it cuts both ways. But
Absolutely.
Some of these kids that I see a ton of, it's just like, I've got more visions of him in my head at 400 pounds than I do of what he was as a senior. And so I think that kind of plays into my skepticism a little bit.
One of the more intriguing guys to watch in the freshman class, Mike, and I think you probably lean the same way as me. One of the guys I'm most looking forward to hearing from sources of, okay, what are they looking like in fall camp?
Yeah.
Next up,
I'm prepared to be very wrong about it. So,
I don't know. I think that your take was pretty fair when it comes to Cam Williams. I don't think people are going to take too much of a problem with that, or, kind of who cares if they do. Austin Jordan from Denton Ryan next up on the list. Somebody that another one I was a little bit skeptical about is a junior of, okay, how would he potentially even fit as a corner? I think that maybe he's more of a safety. I thought he had a pretty damn good senior year. I think that he could play at corner. Kind of still think that his best position could be nickel or safety, but overall, much improved senior year, in my opinion, and comes from one of those programs where, it's going to kind of be tough to bet on a Ryan Rader.
Yeah, I think for me, Austin was a kid that I'd heard a lot about early on from the Ryan coaches. Big frame, great athlete, was running sub-11 early in his career, and is a guy that, when you watch how it translates to the field, is probably better straight line than he is laterally. And I think that's hurt him a little bit at corner. I think if he was a corner, he's probably like a boundary guy only.
For sure.
I just like him at safety because I like him coming downhill. He is a willing and physical tackler. Now, when he does play like man press, he is really physical, really aggressive out there, and uses his length really well. I think that ball skills are a question for me, for him, just kind of watching him throughout his career. But he's a guy that I could honestly see. I mean, I think he's a special teams contributor early. I think he's a guy that he's a good enough athlete that if they get in a pinch at safety this year, he is a guy that we could definitely see get in and get some rotational snaps. Long term, it's just going to kind of be how he develops at whatever position he is slotted into. I think as a safety, he is a guy that could be a top 3 pick. I think corner, his ceiling's a little lower.
Mike, let's go ahead and move on to North Shore's Chris Ross. We're kind of we had a nice little run on Duncanville, Denton Ryan, North Shore, some of the best programs in the state of Texas, which I think, again, just shows in Steve Sarkisian's first real class. I mean, he kind of attacked the blue bloods of Texas. You told me that Chris Ross had one of the more dominant practices you've ever seen in your reporting career.
Yeah, I went to a practice last spring, and he was unstoppable during it. Had 3 or 4 sacks in their team portion, and just couldn't be blocked. And a really interesting build. I think he's a lower ceiling because he just doesn't have the overwhelming size. But I think he actually, 6'2", 6'3", carries the 280 that he was listed at pretty well. Showed some explosive numbers throwing shot put. I think he's a guy that, kind of fits as a 3 technique. And again, you look at him and say, can he give you kind of, I don't want to say Chris Nelson because we kind of already used that, but that similar kind of career path as far as, becoming a later starter and being a guy that has a chance to make the league. I think this is obviously a guy that Bo Davis prioritized from the moment he got to Texas. So he certainly sees something in him. I love the player. I think he's just a little more limited physically.
Yeah, I think that's a fair place to put it. Can't say enough good things about him as a pure football player, and his shot and disc numbers show that he is extremely athletic. The frame is going to be an interesting question moving forward. And I think that he's at the bare minimum, a really high floor to set for your defensive line. I mean, just really, really intrigued to see if he's able to immediately physically handle fall camp. Because if he is, I think that says a little bit more about his ceiling too. If he's able to come in right away and match the physicality of, college guys that are probably 20 to 40, and in Cam Williams' case, like 80 pounds bigger than him. Next up, I think one of the more intriguing and early enrollees, you got Jalen Gilbo from Port Arthur Memorial. Shout out to the Golden Triangle. Mike, I think that the best way to start this is that we kind of know already that Gilbo was pushing for a starting spot in the spring, but unfortunately, with some off the field stuff, kind of progress stagnated a little bit. But when you look at the fact that, 247 had him as the 8th best prospect in the 22 class for Texas, specifically the Texas Longhorns commits, I don't know. I think that one could be on the money, just talking pure football, because, he was kind of coming after Deshaun Jameson in spring camp.
Yeah, I thought Gilbo had a really good chance of forcing his way onto the field this year. I think the off-the-field stuff has derailed that a little bit, and he's going to have to figure that part out. As far as a player, I've known the kid since he was a freshman. Just a really good, solid, fundamental corner. Understands how to play the position, understands leverage, understands what receivers are looking for, reads routes really well. Is a guy that I hope he gets it figured out, because I think he is a guy that can log significant minutes. If he can, I think that pre those issues, he was a guy that we would probably have heavily in the mix this year. I think that he's probably going to have to take a step back. I think if he can get everything solved, you're talking about a guy who's battling for a starting corner position next year.
Absolutely. And Mike, a lot of times when we're talking about potential special teams contributors, it is just that potential, right? We could see Travell Johnson there. We could see Xavier.
Yeah.
Jalen Gilbo will be on kick coverage and punt coverage this year. I have no doubt about that at all. I think that when you talk about him as a prospect, the straight line speed, and especially when you're thinking about corners, that recovery speed, getting in phase and then catching up to receive, that does bother me a little bit. And I think it's why I was a little lower. But at the next level, he could easily move to nickel or safety. And I think he definitely has the physicality. And that was one thing when I got eyes on him in person. He was built as a high schooler, like a college safety. So him just getting an extra little bit of head start on strength and conditioning, I can't even imagine what he's looking like right now.
I worried a little bit about the speed too. I think seeing him at the All-American Bowl, he went up against some really fast receivers during those drills and just kind of negated what they did and beat them at the little things so that the speed didn't beat him long. So again, I just love kind of the way he approaches the game mentally, but got to get those off the field issues cleared up.
Also, Mike, one last thing on Gilbo. A little bit of an inverse of a lot of the cliches that you get, or I'd go even farther, say stereotypes about kids from the Golden Triangle. A lot of times people will just immediately, and there was some of that lazy coverage in the market as well with Gilbo of he's just a stud athlete that, he's real fast, but he doesn't have any sort of technique and he's got to get coached up. And I think that you put it pretty well. He's very technically sound, and he is a very smart football player. You saw that at All-American Bowl practices, where no matter what type of release or anything that wide receivers were doing, he had a answer in his toolbox for it. And I think that he is a little bit of an inverse of a stereotypical Southeast Texas defensive back.
Yeah, he's a really smart kid and really cerebral football player, the way he approaches the game. So if you're covering in our market, just get to know the kid and get to know his play style, and don't just say things based on where he comes from.
Next up, we've got Jaray Bledsoe from Marlin, Texas, played his last year of football
I think we skipped one.
Oh, okay, they're tied on mine at 11.3. So.
Oh, okay, we're going by that. Gotcha.
Sorry. Let's see. Okay,
we'll go Bledsoe. Yeah.
Okay, Bledsoe played his last year at as a junior at Bremond High School. Mike, it's hard not to start there of if we got to see a full senior season from Jaray, if he was, in football shape and didn't show up at the Under Armour All-American game, a little bit, I think understandably not ready to compete against a bunch of All-Americans. What would we think about him? I think probably a little bit higher than you just because of the body composition and also what we saw from the two-way ability as a running back as well. First off, let's just start with the fact that he didn't get a senior year and the fact that he's kind of built like an SEC future NFL defensive lineman.
He's a little bit Cam Williams-y to me, whereas I think the ceiling is there. But there's a lot of unknowns, a lot of question marks. And like you mentioned, didn't get to play his senior year because of transferring to Marlin, which was good for him because, to be frank, he was an academic nightmare at Bremond and got to Marlin, and those guys really took him in and said, you know what, even if you're not playing football, we're going to help you go to college. We're going to help you get your classes in order and get there. So it was a good move for him, even though he didn't play. The only thing I have in my head is I saw him show up at the Under Armour game woefully out of shape and really just struggle overall. So those questions in my head. Now, that said, we've heard he's kind of assimilated pretty well in Texas and will enroll, which is a great, tribute to what they were able to do for him academically. I think the ceiling is there for him to be a very special player, but the combination of him playing at a low level, not playing his senior year, and the only time I saw him being badly out of shape, I could not go much higher on him than I did.
Yeah. Also, Mike, this is just me talking too, so if you disagree, feel free to chime in. If you told me that Jaray Bledsoe was the third highest player drafted from this class, I wouldn't blink. That's how high I think his upside is. Also, I think you brought up some really good points, and I just want to say Jaray has done the right thing once he's got on campus too, to where how you pay back people believing in you, even if you did have academic issues or, whatever. I think exactly what he did right was he paid that back with hard work and listening and being coachable. And I think kind of negated a lot of the red flags that people had about him in that spring. Now, of course, you got to be consistent. Got to stay patient throughout the process, but I'm really high on him even potentially getting some rotational snaps this year. Career expectations wise, I think that the bar for him should be getting drafted in the NFL. I think that would be the baseline.
I think he should be like a top 4 pick, like top 4 rounds.
Yeah, no, I absolutely think that him being a day 2 pick, I think would be, a check for Texas development wise. Like even if he is a day 3 type of guy, that's a passing grade for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I could see him, depending on if he can keep everything going. And, by the way, credit to Texas for a lot of schools pulled out on Jaray, and Texas kind of believed and said, hey, we're going to ride with you on this. And they may get rewarded for that by, being able to get a guy that, look, I mean, at his peak of his recruitment, Alabama was in on, and Texas A&M. A lot of schools wanted Jaray Bledsoe. So, again, a lot of question marks for me. But, yeah, I think that the expectation, and I think, I'm really interested to see what Jaray Bledsoe looks like next spring. I mean, rotational snaps this year, whatever. But, let me see what he looks like next spring and if he's kind of turning into what we thought he might be.
Big time. Somebody next up that we both have as a top 10 guy, and I think are consensus higher on than the rest of the industry. And boy, did he make us look smart this spring. I'd kind of say the MVP of spring for the freshman, it's Frisco's Cole Hudson.
So I mentioned this earlier. We skipped a name. And I thought because you had 11.3 grades on both of them.
Oh, I definitely did just forget about him.
And I know that's your guy, so I don't want to miss this segment. I don't want to stop us on Cole Hudson, but should we talk about Ethan Burke?
Yeah, let's go Ethan Burke quick, who I have as a top 5 player in the class. And, some people will look at me kind of crazy because Ethan isn't physically built, but the potential that he has, and I think that most Texas fans figured it out. Mike, you didn't know this because it was kind of a crusade of mine at my last spot, but I would get to the point during the season where I would post and write about Ethan Burke maybe once or twice a week. And when it eventually came to the time where put in a pick for him to end up at Texas, one of the first comments was, "Oh, great, we're taking Brett at the end of the cycle." And I just kind of lost it on the person and was like, look, if you can't watch the tape and figure out that this guy isn't Brett, maybe find a different hobby. And that's kind of how I feel about Ethan Burke. And luckily, I do think that people started to figure out, kind of helped by Westlake's insane back-to-back-to-back state title run, that there is something potentially really special here at a major position of need, not only when it comes to the position room, but also importance in Pete Kwiatkowski's defense. Ethan Burke, I think, is going to be the kind of prototypical what he wants at the buck position, that kind of more true pin back your ears edge, whereas the jack kind of has to play the run and be a little bit more heavy set.
If you're talking about guys you take at the end of a cycle and like, oh, well, we need to fill a class, so we're going to take this guy and this guy. We just need to check a box for position. Let me tell you that you don't often find guys with the tool sets that Ethan Burke has at the end of that. I mean, it's just fortunate that he was a Westlake. He was committed to Michigan, a playoff team, by the way. So it's not like they were just picking up trash from something else. It was we flipped a kid from Michigan who we basically waited until 11:30 on the night before signing day to go all in on, and it got him. So I think if you look at what he did, the length is insane. Now I don't expect him to contribute early because he's just got so much physical development he's got to put on the weight and be able to hold up at the line of scrimmage. But when you look at what he did, especially in that state title game, him and Colton Vosick were literally they
basically broke the state sack record by themselves. Now, obviously they didn't technically, but they were, I believe they combined for like 6 or 7 sacks. Like it's unbelievable production.
I mean, it was insane. And, that ability to, with the length to get up and bat down balls and things like that, that's huge. And I love the fact that he is an elite lacrosse player. I think that Bill Belichick figured it out in the mid-2000s that, like, lacrosse players have a lot of skills that translate to the football field. And when you're talking about that position and, feet and ability to manipulate your body and do things that you have to do in lacrosse, I think that all those things are, if you're just kind of poo-pooing this as like, oh, he's just a bread take, you're in the wrong. Definitely. I love his potential. I got to see how the physical development comes out to be a little higher on him, as high as you are, but I still had him as a top 10 guy in the class.
Absolutely. And Mike, I think with the lacrosse thing too, you see the short area quickness from Burke, the ability to move laterally so well that, and again, this just could be crazy. With Texas's edge room looking the way it is, with a normal football team, if you have the edge position better stacked than Texas does, I probably don't think that Ethan Burke gets on the field as a freshman. But because of their dire need for pass rushing ability, I actually could see him being a true, hey, it's 3rd down and 13. They know we're rushing the passer, get after it, Ethan. And of course, that's going to definitely come down to how quickly he can get acclimated. I mean, he's been a full-time football guy for not very long. I mean, he didn't even pick up. And I think another thing with Ethan Burke, too, why some fans were kind of upset about the take at first was because Mike, he didn't even pick up his first Power 5 offer, I don't think, until October of his senior year. So,
but Michigan's got a pretty good idea of what they're doing on the edge. You saw that with Aiden.
Yeah, I would say so.
And them, going after him, they didn't want to lose him. It's not like they cut him loose at the end of the cycle.
No, they were pissed about it. They hosted him for basically one of their biggest official visit weekends. And the pitch was, we can turn you into a first round edge talent, take a look around at the locker room. So, I mean,
career expectations, I don't think we covered that, but I mean, physically, if he fills out, I think he's a guy that you could see as a 10 sack guy, double-digit sack guy in college, and probably a top 2-round draft pick. I mean, I think his ceiling
absolutely
is tremendous.
I think the career expectation, so if you want to set a baseline to grade Ethan Burke against, I do think that it's by your junior year, you should be a all Big 12 type. I think that that's the type of ceiling he has. And, I'm not going to lie, I'd be kind of disappointed if, when all was said and done, if he was just a normal starter. But I think you also have to give him a long enough leash to develop. If he doesn't do much during his first 2 years, but we're still hearing promising things behind the scenes and they still think that he has that type of ceiling, I'm not really going to panic. I'm just going to let this one play out. And yeah, Mike, I mean, again, this is another guy to where if he hits, I legit think that he could be a first round draft pick. Mm-hmm. All right. Now we'll move on to, apologies for that. Now we'll move on to Frisco's Cole Hudson, who I do think of the early enrollees probably was the MVP of the spring.
Yeah, I already had high expectations for Cole going into, I thought from the jump, people discounting Cole playing this year were wrong. And now after his spring performance, he's even jumped more in my mind. I went back and watched a little bit of the spring game last night and just thought, there was nothing like where he was overwhelmingly, oh, that's so good. But he also wasn't.
But he was hanging and looking pretty dang good.
Yeah. Look, as a kid who should have been in his senior year preparing for prom, he looked about the baseline of the Texas offense, which not great, but he didn't look out of place with that offensive line. So I've got high expectations for Cole just because I know how smart he is. I know how physical he is. He loves run blocking. Has to get better at pass blocking, played in a run-heavy offense, but is a guy for me that probably the expectations went up after this spring. I think went from a guy that, okay, he should be a multi-year starter and, mid to late pick. I think he's a guy that could be I hate to say 4-year starter. I think there's a chance he could be a 4-year starter. I think he should definitely probably look at being a 3-year starter and a chance to be a top 3 round pick. Maybe from a positional value, being on the interior, maybe if he moves to center, that helps him a little more. Yeah. Guards are so funny the way they treat him in the draft that he could be a really good guard and still go in the 4th or 5th. But my expectations for him have gone up, and I expect to see him a lot this year.
Mike, I think that when we're talking about it too, when we say that our personal expectations are going up for Cole, we do have to say that when we were doing our personal rankings back in the fall, just because, most recruiting analysts kind of do that so they can look back and kind of see what they nailed, what they missed. We both had him easily top 10. We still do, but when we're saying that our expectations went up, that's for a top 10 guy in the class. That's how good of a spring he had. And he looked good in the spring game, and I think that he really had a good account of himself. But even what we were hearing from behind the scenes, what all the fans don't get to hear, was that Cole was just making a ton of progress and is somebody that legit is going to compete for one of the guard spots. I think that it is just really impressive the way that he got to campus and immediately took on the challenge. I mean, another thing too, you kind of hear lip service sometimes about guys wanting to go in and compete for a job, but in the back of their mind, they know, I probably should redshirt. I probably should take 2 or 3 years. Cole's not that type of dude. He knew that he was going to go in and really compete for a job, and huge credit to him because the work has paid off, and I'm really happy that this is on a trend line for a major hit for both of us.
Yeah, hope so. Good kid, great kid to root for as well.
Absolutely. Next up, we've got Spearman's Brennan Thompson, who just is off the backs of running, I believe, the 6th fastest high school 100-meter dash in the country at a 10.2, I think 10.23 actually. The speed is there. That has been clear since he broke out onto the scene. He fits what Steve Sarkisian wants in a wide receiver with that elite speed. Now it's just kind of building the rest of the tool set, Mike.
I expect Brennan Thompson to play this year on – I expect him to get – I would set the over-under at least like 5 returns this year. Yeah, I think you've just got to take some chances. And obviously you've got Deshaun Jameson, who's one of the better return guys in the country. But I think you got to take a chance or two with Brennan Thompson because the speed is so elite. I think you could see him in some packages where they're getting him the ball in space quickly and seeing what he can do. I mean, you know, a lot of development needed physically, a lot of like played at a small level, going to have to get used to speed of the game. But when you talk about speed, that's really not a big question for Thompson, who you know, proved he is elite in that department. Sorry, Winston. Sorry, my dog keeps wanting to come on and join the show. I think a guy that it's going to depend a lot on his fit because he's not really like your traditional type slot. Played a lot of quarterback and stuff in high school, but I could see him being a guy, even though we've got him like higher in the class, being a guy that's probably like a pretty good college player, maybe an all-conference level college player who the speed will get him drafted late. I don't see him being a top end round guy. I mean, a top 3 round guy. I think that the size and maybe the fit is going to relegate him to something different, and the speed is probably going to get him to the next level. But a lot's going to depend on how he's utilized.
Mike, this is going to be breaking news to you, by the way, but you and I are going to do a show closer to football season, probably in the last month leading up to kickoff, of a little bit of a just out and out steal of one of my favorite podcasts of all time, something they do called the Very Specific Things Draft. And it's of the Total Soccer Show for any fellow listeners. I know we have a decent Horns 24/7 soccer community. But the bit is essentially that they'll take 10 things each, extremely specific for the year, and just try to see if they nailed one. One of my very specific things is going to be that Brennan Thompson is going to get a touch pass thrown to him. He's going to go in motion right at the mesh point between whoever's playing quarterback and Beige Robinson, and he's going to get that real quick, just pop touch pass.
Oh, yeah.
And if not, then I'll take the L on that. But like you're saying, he is going to get some run. He's just too fast, and there are a lot of good wide receivers on campus, but the depth isn't crazy with a lot of the guys that portaled out. Let's move on next to somebody that we had a great time with at the All-American Bowl. I think somebody who had a really good accounting and showing for himself at those practices, and that's Donaldsonville, Louisiana's Jamon Tapp.
Yeah, a guy that plays on the edge. I don't think he's like he's not your traditional edge height, but he does have a lot of length. Absolutely. I thought he was just such a crafty pass rusher. He's not like he'll blow you away off the line or anything, but he just uses his feet. So like he's so quick on his feet laterally that he just uses it to like set guys up, and was really like hammering the top offensive lineman in the country.
Can't be said enough. I don't think, like, multiple 5 stars.
Yeah, I mean, he took Keontae Goodwin and Hunter Erb and Josh Connerly, took reps from all of those guys, played inside and outside, kind of did whatever they asked of him. And I think a kid with a ton of potential. I think a kid that with their need at the edge is going to get on the field this year. And I think, could be maybe log 3 or 4 sacks this year. And if he did that, I think that's a great foundation to his career. To me, his height is going to limit him a little bit overall when we're talking about league expectations, but his career expectations should absolutely be a double-digit sack guy, a guy that is looked at as a, day 1 or day 2 draft pick. And I think a guy that really can excel in a couple of different roles, whether it be hand down or like in a 2-point stance off the line.
Yeah. And looking back at my own rankings, I think that I probably should have been higher on Jamon. Still very high, still clearly in the top of the class, but I do think that he's kind of exactly what they want at the Bucs spot. And I think also could potentially the height, you're right that the height could limit him, but with his arm length and everything else, I think that he could even grow into a jack and just be a legit difference maker at the college level. BJ Allen is next up on the list, Mike. You got to watch a lot of him at Aledo, part of some really great teams, two-way player in high school, got to Texas as an early enrollee, and we have heard good things. Definitely strikes me as a very high-floor football player at the college level.
Yeah, super high floor, great range, tackling ability, all those sorts of things. I think BJ Allen plays a lot this year. I think they've got a lot of questions at safety. I think he'll be definitely in the rotation. Overall, I think he's a guy that should be a 3-year starter, should be a all-conference level player, could maybe, depending on things, if he has kind of that Deshaun Elliott type season where he just – gets his hands on a bunch of balls, could be an All-American type player, I think. I mean, I do think he has that potential. I think the ceiling is not quite as high, and that'll probably limit him when you look at what the next level of his career is. But I think a really solid, strong guy that could come in and just go right from the beginning and be a big-time contributor.
And when we talk about roster fit too, Mike, I think that BJ is one of the easier, he is that true single high safety. He is going to be, he is going to be the coverage safe. He's going to be, if they're in cover 3, he's going to be single high. If they're running 2 high or 2 shell looks, he's going to be the guy that is playing field. So with BJ, you do have a clear sense of fit too, which adds a lot when you're talking about expectations and projectability for us.
I think that's a great point for this class overall, because when you look at receiver and DB, the takes they had in these classes, it's like, okay, well, where do these guys fit? Where does Savion Red fit, or Brennan Thompson? Is Xavier Bryce a corner or a safety? There's two.
Yeah, there's a ton.
Yeah, there's 3 guys in the secondary that's like, okay, I kind of know what they are, and the rest are just, we'll piece them together as we can.
Absolutely. Let's go ahead and move on, unless you have anything else on
Nope, I'm good.
BJ, to Nedo Mozie. And I have him as just to be, I guess, transparent. I have him as the 3rd best player in the class. I was a little bit worried about him at the start of his senior year because I thought that his junior tape was some of the best in the state of Texas. And he kind of wasn't performing to that level, and it got me a little bit gun shy. But it turns out that he had an injury. He recovered from it, and he came back. And towards the end of Allen's playoff run, he looked just about as dominant as he did his junior year. I think that I'd feel a little bit better about having him 3 if I knew, he's a really good kid, extremely smart. But there are some off the field stuff, nothing bad, but just kind of mentality wise, that when you're ranking a guy that high, you kind of want to have a little bit of a better understanding of them as a person/player. So I'm a little bit worried about that, Mike. I don't think the talent in the frame can be questioned, though. I mean, absolute stud. And I think another one of those offensive linemen that has a legit shot to go into fall camp and take somebody's job.
Probably not a guy that you'd want in normal circumstances playing this year, but is probably going to have to just – and I think, to me, you asked kind of the same about Cam Williams. I see Nedo kind of slotting in as a guard early, but he does have that potential to play right tackle.
And he had, to be clear, too, real quick, he does have the arm length to legit be a right tackle. Sometimes people will just say that, but when Mike and I are saying that, he could be a right tackle even at the NFL level. He has that level of arm.
He has tremendous arm length. Really mean, really physical at the line of scrimmage. It was a big pickup for Texas. I had him a little lower just because – kind of, again, there's probably too much familiarity bias there for me. And a lot of, the way I cover these kids, it goes into it. But I still had him as a, top 10 guy in the class for sure. And one of the top linemen. I think is a guy that when we're getting into this territory now, these are guys that have to be for Texas. Multi-year starters,
Yep.
For sure, all conference level players. They need to flirt with All American level ability, and they need to be looked at as early draft picks. And I think Nedo kind of checks all those boxes.
Absolutely. Mike, it is one of those interesting things because I kind of think that it sets up a little bit well for him to take a spot. And with that being said, I did hear from a source that he was up at a spring practice. I can't remember which one, but it was one of the scrimmages. And I got a text and said, look, there's somebody that's very clearly injured on the team and that I'm trying to figure out who it is, because there's this guy in street clothes that just looks like a mammoth. And he went over and eyeballed him a little more. And he's like, oh my God, Nedo looks like he has added 15 to 20 pounds of really good weight. So my expectations are pretty high. If he doesn't win a job this year, though, I will say this, not that worried, because when you're talking about freshman expectations, I think for all of the offensive linemen, we'd like to probably see one of them take a job and run with it. But the developmental track for offensive linemen is so much longer than just about every other position. You really don't want to be rotating guys similar timelines.
Yeah, it'd be great if they could redshirt all these guys and just say, we're not going to play any of them. That would be great if you had that situation, but it's just not the reality.
Exactly. Another early enrollee, I think the second to last early enrollee on this list, Klein Cain's Jaydon Blue. Mike, I'll let you take this away because I think that you're the highest of me, kind of the industry, on Jaydon.
Third to last. The next three guys were Jaydon. The next three guys are all early enrollees. I just don't want to lose fact of the vision that Jaydon Blue ran for over 2,000 yards in 6A football in Texas as a junior, ran like 10,700, and was pretty much the number one running back in the country before he sat out his senior year. I don't want to lose sight of that vision. I mean, I think a lot of people's view of him is colored by that senior year, but this is still a player with special potential. Not a guy that you're just taking in any year to kind of fill a spot, but a guy that teams wanted to build a program around at running back and got there early. From what I've heard, he's done everything right. He's in a crowded backfield, but I could see him, again, they're beating Louisiana Monroe pretty badly, getting some late carries and rattling off some big runs. We even joked about it, like, would it have shocked us at the spring game had they pulled kind of the guys higher on the depth chart in the second half and Jaydon Blue ran wild? Now, he didn't. But I didn't feel like he got a great flow of carries in that game. So this is a guy that I'm looking at to be a potential – going forward when Bijan Robinson leaves and this is kind of his backfield, I think he's a guy that can win a Doak Walker. I think he's a guy that, could factor into that All-American conversation, be a workhorse back, one of the best, skill players in the country.
So I have Jaydon towards the back part of my top 10. I think that when you look at him, if you blind resume Jaydon Blue, it is exactly what you're saying of it is that level of speedster. The production's there. There's the ability to make plays in the passing game. So just from that lens, he is an absolutely great prospect. As far as expectations go, I don't actually think that he's going to get much burn this year just because the Texas running back room is insane.
Yeah.
I kind of can't see him even getting past Jonathan Brooks this year unless they want a true change of pace or they need a back with receiving ability. So I do think that is one of Jaydon's problems is that he's just – and it'll up after this year, but for the first year – it'll just be a little bit tough for him. I think that he's going to have a good career at Texas, though. And like you said, the overall athleticism is that of a legit NFL running back. Height is interesting to me. It doesn't really matter that much, but just long-term career-wise, it'll be interesting to see if that eventually becomes a knock on him.
I think I don't expect him to get a ton of burn either, but we have seen that room even last year when we thought, well, this room's pretty stacked, get banged up, and then
Very
all of a
true.
sudden, you are into that depth, and so we'll see.
Absolutely. Let's go on to the next one, and that's Justice Finkley, who you, me, and the other components we used all have as a top 5 player in the class. Mike, we talk so much about measurables. We talk so much about verified athleticism that at times I'm sure it does get a little bit annoying for some fans who sometimes can get of the, well, what matters is how they play on the field. We all agree that Justice Finkley is an absolute monster on the field. And we heard, I'd say that probably the second most about him out of any freshman when it comes to spring ball. Just absolutely a stud, and has already kind of brought a little bit of extra swagger to the Texas program.
His limitations are what they are. He's not built like your classic 6'4", 220-pound defensive end with like great length and everything. He is a more compact player, but I don't think it matters. And I've talked a lot about players understanding who they are and playing like it. He understands that. When I saw him at the Under Armour game, me and Chris Singletary were talking. Chris Singletary, one of our national rankings guys, and saying he understands that he doesn't have the length of a guy like Kelvin Banks. So what he does is he closes space so quickly that Kelvin Banks can't utilize his length. The other thing I love about him is culturally, for what you want in your program, he is a game changer from the sense of fantastic student, a son of 2 doctors, and a kid that is going to just work his bag off for everybody. I mean, seeing him at that Under Armour game, I've said this so many times, but those games are such like just goof off sessions, and him going 110%, 90 miles an hour in practice, every rep, everything he did, it wasn't just noticed by me, it was noticed by everybody. I think he's on the field this year because they don't have edge players. Yep. He's not a 6 to 8 sack guy this year. I think he's going to have to develop into that. I think he's a 1 to 2 sack guy, hopefully, and a guy that gives you just a lot of quality reps, can play the run well, all those sorts of things. I do think the physical limitations are going to limit like his next level. But when you're talking about career expectations, I think by the time Justice Finkley's a junior or senior, he should be an all-conference, all-American level type player who is making the NFL make some tough decisions on, do we want to gamble on the fact that he isn't prototypical, but the production is so good that we can't look away?
I think that's perfect, Mike. And when we're talking about the limiting at the next level, just to be clear too, we're kind of graded with our evals on the NFL draft. So that's what we're talking about with the NFL draft. Mike and I mentioned this yesterday, but like Elvis Dumervil, and you never really want to use the outliers as your examples in data, but it's kind of hard not to with Justice Finkley when we feel this strongly about his ability. Elvis Dumervil was a 4th rounder and then led the league in sacks, multiple-time Pro Bowler. And it's hard not to think about somebody like Justice Finkley in that same category because he just wins consistently in the run game, in the pass game, even though he's not built like your prototypical edge. It's just one of those things. Yeah, okay, maybe he is a day 3 guy, but I still think that when he eventually does get to the league, I really feel strongly that he will. I still think he's going to have a extremely long career in the league, which is more than you can say about a lot of other edges that are built like your true freaks and monsters that people want. Mike really nailed it on the freshman expectations, though. That is the one thing that I really want to warn Texas fans about. Don't go into this season just because the playtime is available at edge being like, oh yeah, Justice Finkley needs 5 sacks to prove he had a good season. No, Justice Finkley just needs to grade well and give that all-out effort. And if he gets 2 or 3 sacks, that's absolutely a plus. Texas just needs as much pass rush ability as they can get. And overall, just playing well should be the baseline because he's going to get on the field. Let's not give him some arbitrary sack number to hit. Let's just, let him pin the ears back and play good football like he has done in just about every setting we've seen him in.
Yeah.
Next
I
up,
agree.
I believe, unless I'm making another mistake looking at a list, there's been a couple of those on this podcast. Terrence Brooks, the last early enrollee. Mike, when we were talking about clear fits for the Texas defensive backs and wide receivers, I think that Terrence Brooks is a pretty clear fit, and I think that it says a lot that he immediately went into the spring and just kind of started handling business. And that's what you'd expect from somebody who's Chet Brooks' son. But also, sometimes guys get to college and they switch up. Terrence Brooks didn't switch up at all.
No, Terrence Brooks is, just phenomenally sound as a corner and a good athlete and all those sorts of things. And it's a reason Ohio State and Alabama and all those schools pursued him. There's a reason it was so huge that Texas was able to flip him on signing day. And he's a guy that, not that I expected that Gilbo was taking time away from him, but Gilbo's loss is kind of Terrence Brooks's gain from that perspective. I think he's already a guy that was going to force early playing time, and now there's just going to be more opportunity for him to do that. I think you'll regularly see him in the rotation this year. I think he's a guy that probably going into next year has a pretty good handle on, depending on how he plays, on earning a starting job. And we're talking, again, should be an All-American level player, and I think has the stuff that you look for in a first-round draft pick.
Yeah, I'm with you all the way. I think that he could turn into a really good player. I just don't want too much on his plate immediately as a freshman. So for freshman expectations, just good, solid rotational snaps, good special teams play. I think that's about it. Career expectations.
It's likely he's going to probably have to start a game here or there, just injury or one thing or another. But with college football nowadays, a DB will tackle somebody and they'll probably get a penalty for targeting and miss a half, so he'll have to start or something. But I think, look, he doesn't need to be Derek Stingley this year and be like an elite NFL corner. He just needs to be Terrence Brooks and play, really solid, set the foundation for the next step.
Perfect. Mike, we are in the home stretch. The people that I'm sure the two players that the people on the podcast are really looking forward to us talking about. So let's start with my number one player in the class, your number two, and I think 247's number two player in the class, and that's Kelvin Banks out of Humble Summer Creek. Just the expectations for his freshman year are ridiculously high, not necessarily from us, but I think the fan base at large. And I guess, I don't know, even from us, there is a little bit of that. All right, Kelvin, you're on campus. Let's see if you go win a job.
Yeah, I think people really need to be careful with that because I love Kelvin Banks. I think he is potentially your franchise left tackle you've been looking for in the future. I do not think that's this year. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'll be wrong, but I think Kelvin still needs to add some things to his game, including some strength development and things like that. Like all the other guys we've talked about, I think he's going to be asked to play quicker than he's probably ready for. I'm hoping it's not at left tackle against Alabama and Will Anderson. I think that would be kind of a disaster for anybody in the nation. But I do think, he's a guy that we're going to see rotational snaps from this year, maybe spot starts here or there, and is a guy that going in next year we should really be seeing what he's doing. And if, his expectations are through the roof, he's a 5-star prospect. So his expectations are to play at the highest levels, probably be a 3 or 4 year starter, and be a very high draft pick.
I think that the interesting thing with Kelvin Banks, even if he doesn't start against Alabama per se, I think there is a legit shot that he's still playing in major games like Oklahoma, the Red River Shootout down the line. I think that is an absolute real possibility. And Mike, it's one of those things too where I've just been kicking around all these thoughts about Banks, what his expectations should be. I do think that there is a level of getting thrown in the pool and sometimes you just swim and it's just, hey, he's a 5-star talent and he's, getting coached up pretty well. And almost I think this happens with true freshman offensive linemen actually a little bit more than people even expect. They're almost, and I should be careful. They're almost too naive to even realize, oh, that's Will Anderson. Oh, that's Dallas Turner. I think the other Alabama edge's name is, that are top 10 draft picks. It's okay. I'm just playing football. Where sometimes if you are a, third year guy and you've seen all the bullets flying and then all of a sudden you're starting against Alabama, that can maybe eat up at you a little bit. I don't know. I think that the career expectations are, regardless of what he does his freshman year, the career expectations are a multi-year starter at a very high level, whether that be All-American or All-Conference, who kind of cares. And then,
let's call it the Sam Cosmi line.
Yeah,
I think that's the rubric.
Yeah, exactly. And then, with Kelvin's tools, maybe even a little bit higher than Sam Cosmi when it comes to getting drafted. I mean, I don't know. It's hard for me to think about Kelvin Banks maximizing and not ending up being in the green room at Radio City Music Hall or wherever they're holding the draft.
If Kelvin Banks maximizes, yes, he will be a multi-millionaire and will end the criticisms about Texas not sending offensive linemen to the draft. So, yeah,
Mike, something that I've kind of kicked around too. Obviously, long term, everybody, or at least most people in the market, know that Kelvin Banks is a tackle. Is there any chance that maybe he could slide into guard only as a freshman if need be?
I think so, but I mean, I think long term you want him to be, your left tackle. But I think, that's probably the one thing I'm interested to hear is kind of where do they see him in fall camp, or is he a guy that they could say maybe he's just our swing guy and we blame it at a couple different positions?
Yeah, I think just my own prediction. I'd love to get your feedback too. I kind of think what's going to happen, it seems like they really liked Hayden Connor at left tackle towards the end of spring camp. And I think that he's going to go in. And I checked in with somebody the other day just to make sure I wouldn't be putting my foot in my mouth. I believe that's where they're going to kind of start things off when it comes to fall camp. That makes me think that Kelvin does have a legit shot at right tackle. He'd be competing with Christian Jones and Andre Carrick and a host of other guys. But I do get that sense that might be a little bit more easy for him than immediately having to start at left tackle kind of day one at Texas. And again, we've talked about this and we'll get it with the next guy. I don't think that he'll be the first freshman offensive lineman to start this year at Texas, but I do think that he has the highest ceiling of the entire class, and that when we're wrapping up and hopefully doing a pre-draft show in 3 years or 4 years, we're talking about Kelvin Banks breaking the streak.
Yeah.
The combined kind of our personal composite or consensus number one player, it's Devon Campbell from Arlington Bowie. Mike, you pretty much nailed this recruitment from start to finish. I think you had a crystal ball in on him pre-pandemic. Not actually, but that's kind of what it felt like.
Right around the pandemic, yeah. Right around the time it started. So,
but when we're thinking about Devon Campbell, I kind of teased it. We both agree that he probably will be the more easy guy to put in the field, just partially because of the position. It's a little bit easier to play interior offensive lineman as a true freshman. But also, I mean, when you're looking at him as a prospect, oh my goodness, he just has everything other than maybe the preferred height and arm length. But I don't know. Who cares?
Yeah, the answer to all questions, if you ask me about this freshman class, is Devon Campbell. I am all in. All my chips are in. I am like setting up to be like, if Devon Campbell busts, it's going to be an all-time L for me, because I have told everybody he's the best player in the class. He's the most ready to play in the class. He is a guy with, we talk about Banks' ceiling, and it's there. Probably a higher ceiling than Campbell just because of positional value and all those sorts of things. But, I mean, if you just want to tell me, like, hey, who you out of this class, it's Devon Campbell, hands down. Mean, nasty, college-ready size, incredible strength, great athleticism, fantastic hands. Our guys at the Under Armour game called him a tone setter. He's a guy that comes out on the field and you know what time it is. I mean, he is Texas has had a lot of guys that are really nice kids that have athletic projection, and we've seen how that. Devon Campbell's a fantastic kid. I have no problem with him. He is ready to get into a he's ready to get into a street fight at any given time. He's ready to. I've known him for 3 years, and I can count on one hand the amount of times I've seen him smile. He's just always kind of in that mode. And that's what Texas needs more than anything, is a guy that is going to pound you into the dirt, enjoy doing it. And he's not really, a team guy. He's not going to really make it about him, but he is, for me, the show this year. I think he is a guy that I don't want to put these crazy expectations on him, because if he doesn't hit them, it's he's a disappointment in year one. But I think he's a guy that has to play a lot this year in the interior. I think he's a guy that by the end of the year probably needs to be a starter.
Yeah.
And
I think too, real quick, it's fair to say some of these expectations for kids that we've talked about are just kind of our own projections, what we think. I think Devon Campbell's play has earned him those expectations. He's so good. The expectations are more earned than put on him, I think, for him specifically.
Yeah, and he's a guy that I would be shocked if Devon Campbell finishes his eligibility at Texas and is not an early entrant into the NFL draft.
Yep. I have something for you real quick too, and this is going to kind of test you, so apologies for putting you on the spot. Is he the highest floor prospect at Texas in how many years? I think he's very clearly the highest floor guy this year, but I was just looking back at a couple classes, not including a Quinn Ewers type who transferred in, but truly high school signees. It's tough for me to think about guys in the previous classes that are as high floor as him, where I legit think that he could walk in.
Bijan is the only one I can think of.
Honestly, that was the only name that even came close for me. And then, with that one, that's a great call, Mike. Another thing for Devon Campbell, is it fair to have the question of day one starter for him? I think that's what a lot of people want to know.
I think it would be fair if he was here this spring. I think that fall camp is a short runway to earn that playing time. And there are guys that are in the mix there, Cole Hudson being one of them, who played in the spring and probably has a head start from that perspective. But I think he's got to be in the rotation. I mean, I wouldn't get caught up on starter or not. Is he giving you a lot of quality snaps? I think that's what you need.
What would be the mark for you to where, okay, I'm a little bit surprised if Devon Campbell isn't starting or getting legit spot reps by, would it be game 7?
I would have to say you kind of know what your offensive line is by game 5.
Okay.
If he's not getting those reps, it's either because the upperclassmen ahead of them have just taken the control and they've taken a big step, and hopefully that's a great sign of things to come, or it's because he's not playing as well as we expected him to. And I think, I'm hoping it's, if that were the case, it would be the first, because I just think that, look, I don't want to sell it too much. There's things Devon's going to have to sharpen at Texas. There's technique things that he's talked with Kyle Flood about, but boy, from just a pure put a football player hat on hat out there, I have not seen many better than Devon.
Mike, and I guess one final thing on Devon, since we do want to give people a decent amount of, meat to chew on when it comes to the end of this mega podcast, which I appreciate you soldiering through with me. What is the best case scenario for you for this year? And do you think there's a chance that he could be the, best player on the offensive line when it's kind of all said and done? I know those are lofty expectations, but when you are talking about a guy that we both kind of think of as a clear-cut truly elite interior offensive line prospect? I mean, these are kind of the questions you've got to float around.
I think if he's the best guy on your offensive line, you've got some problem, because I think that would be most true freshmen. I think he needs to be a guy that you're like, I cannot wait until Devon Campbell gets a full spring in this program and to see what he looks like now. Like next year, I think really what you should want coming out of this year is next year insane expectations.
While the expectations are pretty high, maybe you don't want him as the best offensive lineman in the group immediately. Or, maybe he's playing at a Connor Williams true freshman level and you get a surefire freshman All-American and it's great. Regardless of those expectations, we know for a fact that Devon Campbell is an amazing high school prospect, and we think that that's going to translate to the next level at Texas pretty clearly. Last thing before we go, I'll make you put the sports gun to your head. Let's go one player overall in the class that you really think will meet expectations for their career, and then one hipster selection. I'll let you lead it off.
So like I just said, the answer to every question is Devon Campbell. He will be my first answer there. My hipster pick, I'm going to go with Xavier Bryce. I really love the long-term ability, the tool set, and all those sorts of things. So those are the two guys I'll go with, both Arlington guys.
Yep, and I think that I'm going to go with Kelvin Banks as the safer answer of the two. And then I'm kind of split between two guys. Personally, it's not a hipster pick because I have him as the fourth best player in the class, but I think for how he's viewed as a whole, it would be Ethan Burke. I think that he's going to absolutely crush it. But if you want more, even more hipstery of a pick, I kind of think that Savion Red's going to be, relative to his expectations, a really productive football player for Texas if he stays in the program, stays on the right trend line and everything like that. Okay, Mike, that does it. Thank you for staying with me on a 1 hour and probably 45-minute game of isolation basketball. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, every time Hudson has these ideas, we might just throw a bonus together and, go to this type of style. So we'll see. But we appreciate everybody for listening, for tuning in. Appreciate Taylor Estes for hanging with us during this long game of isolation as well, and technical difficulties and all those sorts of things. For Hudson Standish, I'm Mike Roach, and we'll see you guys next week.